a few quick remarks. My name is Anna Higgins, and I'm a project and policy advisor with the Internet Society, and we're really excited to be partnering with Next Century Cities to host this event for you all today. Now, mapping has been a major facet of broadband policy for many years now, and to put it kindly, the mapping data we have from the FCC has been disappointing at best. Form 477 data has not been nearly granular nor accurate enough to properly show the extent of the digital divide, and everyone knows it, even the FCC. And COVID-19 obviously showed us how significant the digital divide issue was when suddenly everything we did was online. Even now, as schools and businesses are reopening and more people get vaccinated, broadband continues to be a pervasive issue on the national stage. And we have to fully understand the extent of a problem before we can fully solve it. Our efforts to connect everyone to affordable high-speed broadband need accurate and reliable data. Now, we're able to roll out lots of policy and funding without these accurate maps, and those are things that have happened, but we'll never know if everyone is truly connected without the right data. So to remedy this lack of proper data and to know exactly who needs broadband or needs better broadband, we're seeing a lot of governments and organizations at the state and local levels take matters into their own hands and start their own mapping initiatives. I think these initiatives really speak to the power of communities and their ability to organize and advocate for themselves, especially when the federal government hasn't been able to provide them with the mapping data or high-speed affordable broadband. We are big believers that when communities come together, amazing things can happen. And we're looking forward to hearing more about the amazing things that have happened and are in the works from communities and states working on their own broadband mapping data. Now I'd like to turn it over to Lucas Pietrzak from Next Century Cities, and he's going to tell us more about NCC's fantastic report they recently released on state and local mapping.
Thanks so much, Anna. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this really important conversation. I always like to apologize in advance. My dog has a special skill where she knows when I'm talking on a call and finds her loudest toy in the apartment to play with, so if you hear her in the background. As Anna said, though, my name is Lucas Pietrzak, and I'm the program manager for Next Century Cities, and I want to take some time to introduce the report our team has been working on for about the past 6+ months. The report, titled Broadband Mapping Across the US, Local, State, and Federal Methods and Contradictions, takes you across the country to all 50 states, territories, and the District of Columbia. Our team spent countless hours working to gather data from the FCC's Form 477, discover stories from local communities, and learn what states are doing to develop their own mapping alternatives. Even for a team of policy professionals, this report was a very heavy lift. We're really proud of the work we put into the report, but we know that for a single household or even a small municipality, this report would be practically impossible to put together. For years, our members here at NCC have told us time and time again that federal data often does not reflect the reality in their communities. Through conversations with their constituents, community level speed tests, and personal experience, they've painted a picture of an even larger digital divide across the country. We hope that this report allows local leaders and policymakers to understand the state of mapping in the US, and that through our work, we hope that this is the first step of many that will make the conversation more understandable for all people and lower the barrier for those hoping to engage in this conversation. I now have the awesome opportunity to introduce two of our policy team members to talk to you a little bit more about the report today. First, I want to introduce Ryan Johnston. Ryan is NCC's Policy Counsel for Federal Programs and someone who I think is a whiz when it comes to mapping topics. So Ryan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Lucas. So good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you, Lucas, for that wonderful introduction. We'll see how much of a whiz I am here. So as Lucas mentioned, my name is Ryan Johnston. I'm the Federal Programs Policy Counsel here at NCC. And really for my part in this report, I worked very closely with the FCC's Form 477 data, their annual broadband deployment reports, really to parse out how the urban and rural areas in every state have seen their connectivity change kind of year over year. One of the most surprising things to me that our report highlights is something that's actually fairly often overlooked by policy advocates, government officials, and anyone who regularly interacts with this data. And it's that sometimes this data actually does report that people are being disconnected. We often hear so much about what new places have been connected, how connectivity in general is increasing, where service is now, where it wasn't in the past, and how providers have been doing such great work in making sure that unserved and underserved communities are being connected. But we don't talk about those communities that are actually being disconnected. So While there aren't many of these areas, FCC data shows that some locations have become more disconnected in recent years. For example, rural Washington State had a 5.3% decrease in broadband connections. That's 88,000 people that lost access to the internet, according to the FCC. Similarly, New Jersey's overall connectivity decreased from 2019 to 2020. It was only by 0.6%, but that's still 52,000 people that lost access. There are a few more examples of areas that lost connectivity according to the FCC, but while these percentages are often small, they have a very real world impact for the people that they affect. And one of the biggest questions that I think that this raises is that if Form 477 data often overstates availability, does it also understate these disconnections? Granular, accurate, and comprehensive mapping data is critical to actually understand who's becoming more disconnected as well, rather than just saying, how can we connect more people? We need to know who's becoming disconnected and why. So with that, I will turn things over to Corianne Zacher, our Policy Counsel for State and Local Initiatives, to give her piece on what she worked on.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ryan. I'm Corianne Zacher, Policy Counsel for State and Local Initiatives at Next Century Cities. And one of the highlights of the report for me was learning about the impact that community data collection initiatives had on state mapping efforts. While some states rely on FCC data as a baseline, others work more closely with residents and communities to verify the information that they have and paint a more clear picture of what connectivity looks like from the perspective of the people who are trying to get online. In states like Oregon and Michigan, initiatives that began at the local level were able to transform statewide data collection efforts. Although accurate data is a cornerstone of broadband strategic planning, state and federal funding are critical to communities that simply don't have the resources they need for collecting data and developing visualization tools on their own. Beginning in 2009, some states and local governments used funding made available through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act for their first broadband data collection initiatives. When that funding ran out, several of those communities were unable to continue collecting information. But with new funding through state legislatures and federal relief programs, more local and state governments than ever are starting to develop a more comprehensive understanding of what connectivity looks like on the ground in their communities. This information can help inform the next decade of broadband policy. Many of those initiatives include surveys and speed tests, asking residents what service they have and capturing their experiences with connectivity, then comparing those to existing state and federal maps. We're excited to hear from today's panelists and learn more about what those programs look like in action. But before I hand it over, we'd like to acknowledge all the amazing work that NCC's Communications Director, Brittany Ray, put into bringing this week together and spreading the word about today's event. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris Ali to introduce the first panel.
Ooh, Chris, you're muted.
You're muted. Oh, goodness. Thank you. Thank you. Rookie mistake for a media studies professor. Thank you so much, Corianne. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We've got two really exciting panels today to talk about broadband mapping and some of the challenges and opportunities presented therein. Our first panel is called Stories of State and Local Mapping Efforts. So I'm going to ask our panelists to join us on screen, and these are Cullen, Robbins, Pierrette, Renée, Dagg, and Brad Bennet. So first off, I think, so we can get to know everybody, I'd love if we could go around the room and introduce ourselves, maybe in about 2 to 3 minutes, the state you represent and the ways in which access to accurate broadband mapping, or lack thereof, has influenced the way in which broadband has been deployed in your state. Oh, sorry, and Peter Beckett. I missed that on my notes. I'm sorry, Peter. Cullen, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm Cullen Robbins. I'm the Director of Telecom and NUSF, that department within the Nebraska Public Service Commission. We are involved in a lot of different little aspects of broadband. We have a state, like I said, a state universal service fund. So, and part of that is high cost. So we do broadband build out through our state universal service fund. We were also recently given some state funds to run a state broadband grant program. We'll be kicking that off here at towards the end of this year. So part of I guess why this whole topic is very relevant is because we are, part of what we try to do is fit in all of these different broadband projects with what's already going on that's supported through the Federal Universal Service Fund or through other federal grant programs. And, you know, mapping is a huge part of that. And we, you know, we've been involved with mapping various aspects of it for, you know, 10 plus years, really since before 477 came to be. So it's important to us. We're looking at doing additional mapping efforts that would improve upon what is currently available, and we definitely see those benefits. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Pierrette.
Hi, thank you. My name is Pierrette Renée Dagg. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing at Merit Network, and I'm also a PhD student at the University of Toledo. Merit is the longest running research and education network in the United States, and as a nonprofit, we are owned and governed by 12 to 13 public universities in Michigan, and we operate about 4,000 miles of fiber optic infrastructure in the state. As prior to about 2 weeks ago, there was no state broadband office, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of that office and how we might collaborate with them. But over the last 3 years, Merit has developed a robust, extensive program to not only address the digital divide, but also conduct mapping and GIS efforts. And what we've done is we've developed and deployed a citizen-driven approach to broadband mapping. So through this, we match broadband speed tests, obviously to understand the connected individuals, where they're connected and at what speeds. And we've also coupled this with sentiment analysis and other demographic information surveys. And through this, we're able to produce pretty robust and accurate in-community maps for a number of communities in the state of Michigan, and we're slowly looking at expanding that to the rest of the state. And then in addition to that, with the Michigan Moonshot, some of our other efforts are obviously influenced at educating policy members and then educating our general public. So we have created a step-by-step framework to plan, build, run, and secure a broadband network. So this is anywhere between 400 and 800 pages long, depending on the version that you're looking for. We work with policymakers to help other communities deploy these in their areas. And you know, we also are working on developing a pretty robust, extensive video series and webinar series to help individual communities go step by step by step, in addition to some grant programs.
Awesome, fantastic. Thank you very much. Let's move on to our next panelist, Brad.
Aloha kako. My name is Brad Kaleo'okalani Bennet. I am the Executive Director of Auamo Collaborative, a nonprofit in Hilo, Hawaii. I am also a core team member of the Hawaii State Broadband Hui. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Hui is a Hawaiian term we use for a collaborative group that comes together to work on something. So our state broadband Hui has been looking at broadband connectivity over the past year and how it affects various areas of our state. So what we are doing now is through my nonprofit and through partnerships with Kamehameha Schools, Internet Society is a partner in this, and Papa'ololokahi, which is a Native Hawaiian health organization. We're embarking on a rural broadband mapping project, which will go out into communities across the state, across 5 islands, and send people into the communities and using social media to get a more accurate representation of where the connectivity is, where it isn't, what quality of connectivity exists, and if there is no connectivity, where our community members are going to connect. We hope that this project will inform infrastructure development, will inform advocacy efforts, will also, you know, help inform legislative policy in Hawaii moving towards broadband connectivity over the next several years. We're very fortunate. We tried to get this project funded through the state of Hawaii and through our various counties, but budgets were limited. So we were very fortunate to find private partnerships. So I am very proud to say that this project is completely privately funded, and hopefully it's a model for further projects that we're going to embark on down the road.
Great, thank you so much, Brad. And last but not least, Peter. And I do apologize again for forgetting you in the introduction.
That's right, we are the minnow in this operation. I'm a selectman in the town of Appleton. We have 1,300 residents and 26 square miles. And I'm also the chairman of the Broadband Committee. Appleton is in an area of Knox County in Maine, and we've actually been fairly lucky in having a local internet provider who decided to invest in fiber optics about 20 years ago. But as everybody knows, it's quite a large amount of investment that a company has to do, and they've been very slowly putting bits and pieces in every year. But at the end of last year, they were able to get a grant from the government for $2.5 million to run fiber down nearly every road in Appleton, as well as 2 other towns that are nearby to us. They asked the towns if we would actually put together internet broadband committees to help them do this. And one of the reasons why they got the grant was because the government was providing money to enable students and teachers to access the internet to be able to work at home. And we were able to work with the local Tidewater company to match up their database with our school database so that they could know exactly where the children were and the teachers, so that they could actually map out where they were going to run the fiber runs, and also map out the installation of those people. Just recently, the government, the state has actually issued a $15 million bond, and we were able to apply for another $750,000, and Tidewater put in $1 million, and they're going to provide free connection to everybody in Appleton and Hope and another town over the next 2 years. But what I see for this whole internet problem is it's very much a grassroots thing. It seems to me that by having these broadband committees in each town, by giving them the funds and the access, you've really got to work with your local telephone or internet provider to find out what is it that's stopping them from actually investing the money to put fiber into every home. And there are definitely some barriers to that. We're a rural community. We've got a lot of people who don't earn a lot of money. We have people who don't even have computers, actually, who would like to have computers. So in this next go round of money that the government's giving, we're actually looking to provide computers for people so they can actually access the internet. So by the end of this year, we expect to have Appleton to have fiber optics 100% available in every road, and to have, I think it's 35 or 40% of the inhabitants to actually have fiber optic connections.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. Before I get into more questions, I'll just a message to our audience. If anyone has any questions for our panelists, please do put it into the Q&A pod, and we'll do our best to answer them in real time. So I know that this panel is about local stories about broadband mapping, local and state broadband mapping efforts. But I thought we could start off just by kind of reflecting on what's going on at the federal level. Obviously, a lot of changes, a lot of proposed changes to mapping. So to the panelists here, I'm curious about your access to federal broadband mapping data, and when that data is accessible, how useful is it to the work that you're doing in your communities and your states? Brad, maybe I'll start with you with that question about federal mapping.
Yeah, thanks. We, see the NTIA maps. We are actually partners with several people from FEMA who come onto our broadband calls as well. I think one of the issues with the federal mapping is a lot of the data is either is reported by the service providers. So some of it is not extremely accurate, especially in places like Hawaii, where we have services across 7 different islands. We have very rural areas where there's no fiber infrastructure being built. It's not cost effective for the service providers to do so. I think some of the mapping is wishful thinking in our case, and then the other piece of that is kind of extrapolated based on where fiber is supposedly exists, and where where people are reporting connectivity. So I think for our project, we want to kind of get out into the community, send people out into these rural communities, indigenous communities, which are fairly insular, in our case, and really send people out to get an accurate representation, speed test, ask actual questions. But we have access to the federal maps. They're useful for us in planning how we're going to do our local mapping efforts. But as far as accuracy, I'm not quite sure how accurate they are. And I can only speak for Hawaii. So,
great. Thank you so much. I totally agree with you on the challenges of mapping fiber in particularly when you're thinking about dark fiber. Cullen, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have used the FCC Form 477 data, like I said before, for quite a long time, and I'm sure most people are pretty aware of the shortcomings with Form 477 data. So we are very eager to see what the FCC comes up with next with the digital opportunity data collection. I think particularly in a state like Nebraska, we have a lot of rural areas, very large census blocks where 477 mapping, where the shortcomings of 477 data are really, really kind of float to the top. They're very obvious. We have census blocks in Nebraska that are, bigger than, well, they're huge. They're bigger than a lot of counties in some places. So, if there's one person served in some of those census blocks, you could literally have 15 miles until you hit the next household, but it's going to appear like they're both served. So those shortcomings, I think, are things that we really want to see improvement on. The other thing I'll point out about 477 data that I don't know if it'll improve with the next go around with the FCC or not, but just the timeliness of it. By the time they release a public version of the data, it's almost a year out of date, maybe more in some cases. So I'm hoping there's a much quicker turnaround. The one thing I will say for 477 data is they do release the raw data, and it's helpful for us to be able to map that on our own. And I think that's nice in some ways. We don't have to rely on their public-facing map product, which may or may not do exactly what you need it to. So, yeah, we're chomping at the bit to get something better from the FCC, and on our own try and collect improved data if that's going to be something that's useful. So, and it is in some cases.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Pierrette. Would you like to add to this?
I would. I think that all data sets are useful. However, in our communities, what we're really using the data that we collect for is to help inform infrastructure planning or to do some of that first level feasibility study for various types of community and municipal owned networks. So through that lens, a lot of the FCC data is not very helpful. We've done a number of studies, and we've seen on average between 47 and 52% difference in coverage availability between what we found in our citizen reported data and the FCC. So obviously there's been a lot of discrepancy there. So I think one way that we do leverage the Form 477 is as we're going into a community to help do some of these mapping surveys. If there are areas in that community that the Form 477 says are unserved, we know they probably are unserved because that data is not over-reporting the unserved portion. So for our limited amount of outreach efforts that we're able to do, or our perhaps citizen direct mailing and things like that, we know that if we want to reach the unserved, we start with those areas that the FCC says are unserved to target some of that extra outreach, because we know we'll probably not be able to reach those citizens through digital medium. So it is useful, but it's definitely limited in the tactical, worthiness of the information.
Great. I would completely agree on those points. Thank you. Peter, would you like to add?
Yeah, I must admit, this is actually the first time I'm hearing about SEC 477 data, actually. You know, we've been very much focused on our local setup, but in fact, we actually went to the telephone company and asked them to give us maps of where they thought their fiber optic cables went. And we went out and actually traveled down every road looking up at the telegraph poles. And you can tell because of the red band that actually gets attached to a fiber optic cable, whether it is actually a fiber optic cable there. And we actually found a number of mistakes in their current maps, and they were able to get them corrected. But I just looked online at the 477 data, and it's very regional, it's very broad. You know, it doesn't get down to the road. You know, we've got, say, 20% of our roads that don't have it at the moment, but it looks like everybody's got it. So that's what I would see as probably the biggest issue in that data.
Absolutely, yeah. The broadness and the lack of granularity, I think, is one of the major critiques of the Form 477 data.
Yeah.
Now, one thing, kind of to flip it on its heels now, I mean, all of you have mentioned the importance of local efforts, right? Peter, you were just saying the importance of grassroots and getting people out and looking at actual polls and those red lines and mapping. And Pierrette, you'd mentioned local, and Brad, you talked about getting people out there. So I'm wondering if you could all reflect on the importance of state broadband mapping programs, engaging with municipalities, with communities, with grassroots people, to make sure that we are developing as accurate maps as possible to do exactly the type of work, Pierrette, that you had mentioned, the importance of that outreach. So I was wondering if maybe you could start with that, the importance of state engagement with local municipalities, counties, communities.
Yeah, I certainly can't speak to the state's effort yet, because like I said, the state is new.
Right.
But
Right.
Merit is a research and education network. What we have found, because all communities are on limited budgets, especially our rural or our underrepresented communities. So in order to reach the most amount of people possible for our mapping efforts, we've developed a community outreach partner program. So what we do is we ask regional planning groups or broadband task forces or steering committees to help us populate lists of fraternal organizations, schools, community anchors, libraries, things like that, people who may be interacting with other members of the public, senior centers, things like that. And then we provide all of these community outreach partners a toolkit. So it's yard signs, it's flyers. We've done stickers for pizza boxes. We've done little trailers on movie theaters, community access station things. You know, we do all of these different pieces that our outreach partners can use to reach their own communities, because a lot of the time the limited advertising or outreach dollars that we have really won't reach all those people in community. But if we have all the librarians and all the municipalities, and you know, we're sticking inserts into tax mailers, and it really is that grassroots community engagement effort, that's when we really see the needle move. And then furthermore, I know, you know, perhaps Brad can speak to this a little bit too, because he mentioned the insular nature of his community. We have plenty of various communities that we try to reach who may need different types of engagement. So whether it's elderly or senior populations, our Spanish speaking community, we're working with a community right now that has a pretty large Burmese speaking community as well. So there are a lot of ways that we can't reach them, but these community anchors can. So I think without the community outreach partners that are really gathered together by the municipalities and the communities and the townships, I don't think our efforts would have been successful at all.
That is amazing. In the last 2 minutes, I learned of so many different strategies that you were talking about. I mean, putting it pizza boxes and stickers sounds incredible. Some sort of marinara and mapping broadband event. It's just great reaching people where they are in communities. Peter, maybe you can talk about that, given the isolated nature of your community, different types of outreach efforts that you're making into the community.
Yeah, so you know, being a rural community, there's a lot of word of mouth. You know, we don't have a local pizza store for a start, so it's a good idea. I like that one. So it's really word of mouth. From our selectmen, we send out an annual mailer to everybody. So we put something in our annual mailer and ask people to respond back to us. But you'll find a lot of rural communities, actually, people are very reluctant to tell you about things. It's very interesting. They have a distrust of government for a start. And the thought of getting government involved in fixing their problem is actually kind of strange to some of these people. We obviously do have a lot of people who are willing to reach out to us, but we also have a lot that aren't necessarily that good at doing it. But we also, in our local county, we've got a lot of things going on. There's a group that decided that they wanted to be able to set up a company which would actually lay all the internet, all the fiber optic lines, so that the county actually owns the cables, and they're getting grants to get that up and running. But like most things, that's going to take a number of years to roll that out. And while we're talking about time frame, one of the things that our local internet provider realized is once you've got all that fiber optic in the street, the demand to actually get connected up goes up dramatically. And they're actually a company of, I think it's 55 or 60 people. They're actually looking for 14 additional people to connect up fiber to the homes. So it just goes to show that even if you put fiber in the street, do we have enough people to actually connect the stuff up?
I mean, that is a great point, especially thinking, we've often thought this is like a field of dreams, right? If you build it, they will come. But there's so much outreach that has to go along with the building process. So thank you for that wisdom. Cullen, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how Nebraska has utilized resident feedback to improve mapping in the state.
Sure, I'll bring it up a little bit. Just the disclaimer, the state, and as in our Public Service Commission, is not the one that's doing this, so I'll kind of give a shout out, but it's not us directly. So it's really one of the economic development districts that spearheaded this effort, and they're kind of doing it in collaboration and partnership with a group of economic development districts. They have started a kind of a speed test and mapping effort that just essentially requests citizens to run speed tests on their home computers or devices, and it collects and maps that information based on user input information. It's been up for a few months now. I think they're getting somewhere close to 10,000 different unique speed tests, and I think that's a pretty interesting effort, and something that we've been watching very closely, because I think it's been very informative. And one thing that I think maybe you initially asked about that is kind of important is that we as the state maybe aren't as good at doing that kind of outreach to the municipalities and counties and that kind of thing. So it feels like at least in this situation, the economic development districts are much better equipped to do that kind of outreach, because I think they've, at least at this point, gotten a pretty good response to what they're trying to do. So really interesting effort, and something that, like I said, we're paying close attention to as to whether we can maybe replicate something like that or collaborate with what they're already doing.
Absolutely. Kind of thinking that this is a kind of an all hands on deck. You need so many stakeholders involved with these outreach, exactly like you just said. Brad, from your perspective, what level of collaboration between the Hawaii state government and localities have you seen while working to collect better broadband mapping data?
I think Hawaii as a state, as a state government entity, is in its infancy as far as really exploring broadband, the need for broadband. We were very happy. We were able to push for and get established the first State of Hawaii Broadband Office in the last legislative session. So that is starting. There has been somebody acting in that capacity over the last year. His name is Bert Lum. He's been behind a lot of the efforts that we are undertaking across the state as far as broadband, and group and our group collaborations. And he's working with the various county governments as well, and each county is in different stages of trying to figure out how they address broadband connectivity. I think for us, what's really been working over the past year is really reaching out to our community organizations. We have a lot of organizations dedicated to Indigenous and Native Hawaiian health and other other services. So we're partnering our broadband efforts, our computer distribution efforts with other groups who are doing who are trying to address food sovereignty issues, doing food distributions. We're putting the two together to because there are both very serious needs across the state of Hawaii. And again, as I said earlier, because of our geography, there's an issue with trying to build infrastructure across 7 islands, and into these very rural areas. And so I think part of the outreach for us is not trying to treat this like a census opportunity where we're hiring a whole bunch of people from our urban areas and sending them out into these rural areas to ask questions. I think what we're going to do with our project is we want to hire what we're calling community liaisons who come from those communities to ask their neighbors and ask their neighbors the questions that need to be asked, and hopefully we get a little more buy-in. There's a little more trust developed. We're also partnering with University of Hawaii, and we're sending out nursing students and social work students to go out into these communities that they're going to be working in the future anyway, and start establishing these relationships and really trying to get the communities to understand that we're not asking these questions to be invasive. We're not asking these questions so we can check a federal box and try and receive funding. What we want to do is actually figure out what kind of connectivity you have or you don't have. What do you need broadband service for? How many people in the household, are you utilizing it for work, for education, for access to the digital economy? And we're also trying to figure out where we need to get devices to as well, because we have a computer distribution project in the rural areas where we can provide people computers at no cost in a rural area. So we do our elderly community with our disabled community and our students. So I think hopefully all of this work and we get a little more buy-in by actually going into the communities with people who are from there. I really appreciate the ideas that Pierrette shared. I'm gonna get some pizza box stickers made tomorrow, and we're gonna start doing that because I know that people in the rural communities order pizza a lot. So we're doing it. Thank you.
People in rural communities order pizza, college professors order pizza. Pizza is a great unifier in the broadband universe, I think. So I mean, these are great. These are such great and seems like very kind of low risk, low stakes opportunities for all of us to engage in outreach and to connect with our communities through the lens of broadband and broadband needs in particular, and device needs, just like Brad and Peter were saying. So I'm wondering then, we've got these resources, these budding resources. What are then some of the barriers to better broadband data collection in your areas? What barriers are you confronting? Cullen, maybe I'd start with you on this one.
That's a really good question. I was hoping you'd start with somebody else, but that's okay. No, barriers. Well, it's just, well, first of all, there's a lot of information. It's trying to figure out exactly, you have to know exactly what you need to collect, what's important to know. It was touched upon earlier that FCC has carriers self-report what their maximum advertised speeds are. Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, is that really what you want to know, or are you really more interested in user experience? What kind of speeds are people actually receiving? And then you get into more questions when you're looking at different speed test methodologies. Are you interested in what the service is capable of? Are you able to kind of factor in that some people order lower tiers of service and a speed test might not reflect what's actually available? So I think one of the things is just making sure, entities that are interested are really understand what kind of data they want to collect, because it can get pretty complicated as you kind of dig into it. But that's certainly a barrier. For some, I'm sure that cost is for some entities that, one of the things that we've been a little bit hesitant to do in terms of starting our own big data collection effort is that it costs a lot of money. And if the FCC is going to do something that essentially is a duplicate of what we're planning to do, is that really the best use of limited resources? Unfortunately, the FCC's efforts haven't seemed to move as fast as everybody has wanted to get to this new data collection methodology. So we're still kind of wrestling with that question. Do we start putting money into a better data collection methodology that could just get duplicated here in a year or so?
Definitely important barriers to be thinking about, and I think also important messages for anyone on this call who are working at kind of this state level and thinking about doing exactly what you said. Do we engage in our own broadband mapping efforts, and what is it that we actually want to be mapping, and making sure we don't duplicate existing mapping efforts. Pierrette, maybe if you could weigh in here on some of the barriers to broadband mapping and data collection.
Yeah, absolutely. We pretty much touched on these a little bit, but for us, the biggest barriers, because we felt it was important to start now on doing a lot of the broadband mapping, because we've got communities who are trying to apply for grant funding. We've got communities who are either using this to help inform their build outs, or they're starting on the planning stages of network planning and network architecture design and things like that. So we didn't really have a choice but to start now with the broadband mapping efforts. And for us, it's all of the barriers. And I think that my barriers are going to be pretty similar to most other communities' barriers. We've got the unserved population. So those are the people who can't interact with any kind of a mapping project digitally. So to counteract that, we've got, I put it in the chat earlier, we've grown to have SMS, text, cellular, web-based, 1-800 number, and then we've got a Scantron paper version of the survey. And then we've also got community anchors who work with some of our communities who may not trust or interact with some of the city officials as well. So I think it's the digital availability or the digital comfort or digital skill set of those who are involved. I think that money is always going to be an issue, because if money were no issue, we could flood TV, radio, billboards, we could do all of the outreach. And to counteract that, that's why we developed the community partner engagement. Obviously, just the sheer scale is going to be a challenge too. So, I mean, this is something that to get granular, citizen-driven, citizen science, self-reported information, that's millions and millions of people in many different states doing that effort. So I think that just the sheer amount of people means that obviously to get a fully robust picture, it's going to have to be a time component as well. So it's going to have to be a longitudinal data collection. I think there's a lot of things that kind of are going to work against us. And every time we come up against one of those, we just continue to do our best to say, how can we reach this population? How can we overcome this economic challenge? How can we work with local community stakeholders to start getting the data? And, we don't have every single household mapped, but, just the way statistics work, the more information you have and the more data sets you have, and the more that we collect, and then the others, as other data sets become more robust or more granular or more reliable, we can also work on layering those over it too, so we can work on developing this large holistic picture in spite of a lot of those barriers. And I do think that if others on the panel here or anybody in the audience has other ways that they have overcome some of these challenges, I would love to hear them.
Great. I would also welcome if anyone wants to put it into the chat or into the questions about exactly what Pierrette had said and kind of, sharing some best practices. I think this is what's really cool about these opportunities, right? Is that we can all be together and to have these great conversations. Peter, what are some of the barriers to data collection, broadband mapping, and deployment that you and yours are encountering up in Maine?
We're probably a little bit different because we've actually got an extremely good relationship with our local ISP that provides us with almost any data we ask them. And so we've been able to get our state's 911 data, which maps out everybody's individual address, exactly where they are on a digital map, and get the address data from our local ISP and actually brew those two data together and draw a map and color it to show which plots and which places have got it and which don't have it. But that actually only works for that one provider. There are obviously other providers out there like satellite, where we have no relationship with the satellite people, and that's starting to creep into Maine. We've noticed the little satellite dishes from Starlink starting to go up, and also microwave. We've got a local microwave provider, although you look at their map, you can see the coverage. You actually go to somebody's house, they can't actually see the thing on the pole anywhere, so they can't actually get it. So that's sort of one of those little challenges that if you think that provider can do it, they can't necessarily do it with in every house that's within their area. But overall, we're very lucky. We're able to get pretty accurate data for the vast majority of our households.
Great, that's great. That's great to hear. Thank you. Brad, your thoughts?
For us, I think there's a couple of challenges. The first is convincing our state and county governments that mapping efforts are important and should be funded. We do realize, of course, that due to COVID, the government, coffers weren't exactly overflowing. So what we wanted to do was find partners that we could start this project without asking the government for money, and prove, kind of a proof of concept sort of thing, where we can demonstrate that this is important information. We can get the information and it'll be useful information. Hopefully down the road, when funding levels are back to normal, we can get our state and county governments involved in the funding. Another challenge for us has been really helping our service providers understand that this mapping effort that we are undertaking is not any sort of statement on the service they provide or how they are providing it. And we're not attacking them. We're not trying to say that they're not doing what they're supposed to do. We understand that there are limitations to what for-profit companies can do, but we do also want to have that information. So if there is some way that we can partner with them in the future, to what we have been doing across the state in our rural areas also is, in partnership with several other private groups, is creating community broadband networks, which are self-managed ISPs. So I think some people on this call are familiar with Pu'uhonua Waimanalo, which is it's a group of sovereign citizens, sovereign Hawaiian nationals who have a spot out in Waimanalo, and they have their own self-managed ISP. So they manage their own, they bring the service in, but they manage how it goes out to the members of their village. Where another one is being created in Waianae on our west coast of Oahu. So there's been another Pu'uhonua concept out there. We're doing several Wi-Fi on wheels, Wi-Fi on walls projects out in some other rural areas across the state. And we're also looking at some mesh network projects. We're trying to make it fit we're not trying to promote a one-size-fits-all for our rural communities. We're trying to get this information and figure out what works best for them to get service out to the community. So again, it's not a matter of us trying to pass any judgment on our service providers. And the last piece for us, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, is just the geography of living in an island state. So those are the things we're working through. But I think with our partnerships and I will say that there has been interest from from legislators, from the governor's office. They understand what we're doing, and I think they want to see how it works out. And I'm hopeful that our success will lead to further efforts moving forward. So.
That's great, and what a great way to start to wrap up this panel on the idea and the importance of hope, right? I've learned so much, and we've only got 4 minutes left, and I wish we could continue this conversation all afternoon. But I want to leave the last word to all of you. So I was wondering if you each could offer kind of a last thought, a wrap-up thought you've each got about a minute to wrap up, and some key takeaways, what you want to emphasize, what are the things that we should all know as we go about concluding this panel. Peter, would love to start with you.
I think the biggest effort that we would put in for actually putting out broadband into an area is to find a way of being able to link up with your ISP. I mean, we're very lucky that our ISP was completely open with us, but that's because it's a local company. I can imagine, we do have the larger companies around here, and those towns that have tried to contact those larger companies have been rebuffed and can't get through the barriers of reaching the right people to find out what's going on. So anything that a nationwide organization could do to try and open up those doors, I think would help this whole effort dramatically to start to do the mapping.
Great. Thank you. Words of wisdom there. Cullen.
Sure. I guess probably the most hopeful thing that I think about is that, as we improve our mapping and learn much, with much more granularity where broadband is and isn't, at least right now, the good news is that there's a lot of funding sources for broadband deployment, especially in our state. I mean, it's almost hard to keep track of it in some ways, some of the money that's coming for broadband deployment. And, so build out's happening. I think service is improving certainly throughout our state. And the better we get data through our maps, the better we're able to target where that money goes and where it's needed. So I think that's something that I certainly haven't seen in the years that I've been with the commission. There's just a lot of opportunities. So that's definitely a good thing.
Definitely a good thing. All right, Pierrette.
I think that the biggest lesson we have learned so far over the 3-year journey that we've been embarking on is that there's really no one size fits all approach. So we've been working with on a kind of a larger scale. So we've been working with all sorts of communities throughout the state of Michigan, and these are very small, economically repressed townships and very large urban inner cities and everything in between, and every type of population where access is an issue or affordability, or there's not a local ISP, or there are many competing ISPs, or the goals of that particular community who are looking to have a community network or a community ISP are different than others. So for us, or even the solution that they may be looking for mapping for, whether it's fiber or a mix of technologies or whatever it might be, we just have to keep in mind for us that it's important to understand as you move forward, what are the goals, what are the limitations, what's the ultimate outcome, and just to know the communities that you're working in, and to understand that you have to be flexible and agile at every point in time as you go through, because nothing that works for one community to get accurate mapping or an accurate understanding of sentiment is going to work for the next community.
Great, and that is such an important message, and yet we can still learn from each other, and we need to pick and choose what is going to work in our communities, and sometimes we need multiple strategies to work within the same community, and that's something I'm hearing from all 4 of you, the importance of being very flexible in our approaches. Brad, the last word goes to you.
Thanks. Okay, I think my approach to all of this, and I think what's important about universal broadband connectivity across the state of Hawaii, is that it's not just a utility issue. It's not just a matter of, there being a need for it to, but there is, right, to access government services, because a lot of government services are moving online anyway, even after the pandemic. So, having the connectivity and ability to do telehealth, to do education, to do online shopping, access government services, whatever the need is important across our state, of course, and as it is with every state. And for us, while our work with the mapping is going to hopefully have positive results for their entire state, for me as a Native Hawaiian, it also provides a level of self-determination for our Indigenous communities. It allows people to kind of have a bit of control over how they access the internet, how they provide these services to these rural and these rural communities, how our people can utilize the internet and can utilize the skills that they can gain by building their own networks to really provide a level of sovereignty over how Native Hawaiians access government services and how we interact with our government in the state of Hawaii and the federal government as well. So for me, it's not just a matter of importance of utility. It is a very, as a Native Hawaiian, again, this is it's an issue that's close to my heart and really something that we want to focus on for the betterment of our people and all Indigenous people across the state of Hawaii. So.
Again, great way to end, that the importance that broadband is about people at the end, right? Not about technology or money or policies or politics. Broadband is about people and making sure that our communities and our countries and our Indigenous populations are served. I want to thank all four of you so much for sharing your experiences and your wisdom today. I learned so much. Thank you so much. I really hope we can keep this conversation going offline, online, in all the various ways that we communicate now. I'm going to ask maybe that the four of you go ahead and stop your video, and I'm going to introduce and invite our next round of panelists to come on board to the Price is Broadband show here. I would like to invite Francella Ochillo, Kathryn Pierrette, and Samantha Schartman-Cycyk. I hope I said your last name correctly, Samantha. This is our second panel today on state and local broadband mapping efforts. And this one is called Leveraging Better Mapping to Close the Digital Divide. What I'd like to do is once again invite each of you of our distinguished panelists to introduce yourselves, your organization, and the work you are doing. Give you about 2 and 3 minutes maybe to do that, and then we'll get into some really awesome discussion. So Francella, could I start with you, please?
Well, thank you so much, Chris. And I'm going to keep it brief because I know we are getting to the end of the day and there's already been so much good stuff floating around. But I do want to start my comments by saying, number one, thank you to Internet Society for partnering with us on this event, and also to Corianne, Ryan, Lucas, and Brittany Ray, all of the accolades that we've received this year and all of the sunlight. Thank you for your tireless fight to make sure that the local stories that we find get the oxygen that they deserve. My name is Francella Ochillo. I'm Executive Director of Next Century Cities. We work to support local officials in their efforts. That includes elected officials, community leaders, concerned citizens who just care about making sure that every single resident has access to broadband. That's what we do. We make sure that they have options to find out how to make plans for themselves, to learn from other communities, to document their voices on the record at every level of government, and just to make sure that they know that somebody far away in Washington, D.C. is making sure that they get the light that they deserve. So again, thank you so much for putting light on this issue. Obviously, based on our report, we care a lot about mapping and not so much about pointing fingers about what we didn't get right, but really focused on what we can do with good data.
Wow, awesome. Thank you. I love this idea of putting light on these issues. This is so important. Kathryn, I was just listening to a panel that you were moderating just an hour ago. So you're doing double duty today. So thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks for listening to the panel as well. As Francella said, also thank you to the Internet Society for pulling this group of folks together. I think it's always so great when you hear from the people who are implementing at the local level and those of us who kind of look at the macro perspective, because at some point you meet in the middle and you figure out really what's working and how to scale those solutions. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kathryn DeWitt. I'm the project director for the Broadband Access Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. My team has been looking at how states are responding to the digital divide. So policy, program, what's working, what's not working, and what lessons can we take to other states and now to the federal level. So I've had the good fortune with working with a lot of these folks on this call and working in the states where some of you do your work, and really excited to talk to Francella's point about how do we shine a light on what works. And I would also be remiss if I did not give a shout out to the great research that the Next Century Cities team has done. Show me your maps, as always, really insightful, actionable, and incredibly useful for those of us who work in research and directly with local leaders. So thank you and congratulations. Chris?
Thanks so much, Kathryn. Samantha.
Right. Hi, everybody. Apologize if my connection is bad. I'm joining from Myrtle Beach on the beach. So here I am. Anyways, my name is Samantha Schartman-Cycyk, and I am the executive director. You're fine. I'm the executive director of the Marconi Society. So we are working with Measurement Lab and a good handful of other national organizations to launch a national broadband coalition, broadband mapping coalition, apologies. And so we're just launching that this last month. And so I'll be able to share more information about that soon. But the hope here is that, we're really looking to try to raise public awareness about the importance of gathering network data analytics for the purposes of advocacy and equitable access to federal funding and support and all of that needs to happen for all of the reasons that we have already heard from the shortcomings of national, the 477 forms, et cetera. However, we do have a bit of a perspective in that we're hoping to, really talk a little bit about the importance of making sure that whatever data collection methods are used, that they are open and transparent and able to be peer reviewed. Because one of the big problems that we have seen is that a lot of the prevailing mapping methodologies are proprietary. And because of that, they can only be shared in aggregate, and the understanding of what those aggregating mechanisms are not fully transparent or able to be vetted by a research audience. And so it makes then layering that or pairing that with other data sets a little bit more convoluted because you don't exactly know if you're comparing apples to oranges. And so, what we're hoping to do with the coalition is to bring together leaders that do use different mapping methodologies to kind of talk about how we can come together and figure out some best practices and methodologies for aligning different types of data, collection methods and speed test types and things of that nature in a way that it can be more openly reviewed and transparent. So the idea of taking that and decentralizing the process of data collection is a really important one in order to, kind of give the power to become eligible for support and federal programs over to the communities that are using them is really important. But at the same time, what we're seeing across the country is a lot of different methodologies being used. And so that can also muddy the waters as we're all trying to move in the same direction. So, having a discourse about how we can work together and align our efforts more intentionally, I think is something that we need to do a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great point, and the importance of coalition building. And I love this idea of transparency in our methodologies and in our data collection and in our writing as well. My first question to the three of you is, we just had this most amazing panel about local experiences and insights and wisdom. And I was wondering if I could ask each of you to start off by reflecting on the previous panel and what were some of the high level takeaway points that you saw, or maybe that surprised you, or that you would like to emphasize or underscore. Kathryn, would love to start with you, please.
Absolutely. I think honestly, the thing that that kept running through my head was no one talks about how much work it is to get this done. Thanks. Thank you. Yes. I figured I'd have a captive audience with this one, but we don't talk about this enough. This is not as simple as we put a grant out into the world and we say, okay, it's done. It takes an enormous amount of effort and time and relationship building, and yes, resources, to get out into the community, build the trust that Brad was talking about, and that is so essential, but to really understand what's needed. And that's just the planning phase. Then we don't even move into implementation, securing funding. So as we think about moving forward, how do we support local efforts? This is why we need funding for planning. This is why we need funding for technical assistance. This is why we need people in government, whether it's federal, state, and also within community organizations, trusted community organizations, to help community leaders do this work, because it just takes an enormous amount of time and effort. So that's my thought. So I really take my hat off to the folks who are doing this work on the ground, because it is not easy. And the progress that all of you have made, particularly in speaking on that last panel, is just enormously impressive. So thank you for sharing your stories.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. We don't talk about the work, the labor, the effort that goes into this. Samantha, I saw some very enthusiastic snapping. So maybe you'd like to go next.
Sure, I'll keep it brief. I can't agree more. I mean, Kathryn, you're absolutely 100% right. I've done community outreach and program work, and it's difficult. The only way that I will say is that, what I've said for a long time is that the digital inclusion community are really the super connectors of the social service industry. That this community has representatives everywhere. They are in the libraries, they are in social service, they're in housing, they're in banking, they're everywhere. And so really mobilizing that network is a powerful, powerful tool. And yes, to go back to what Kathryn said, they need funding, they need help and support and resources to continue doing that and stabilizing that network. But it is something that can be mobilized. And the way that we do this kind of data collection is through a high touch case management, community, grassroots driven approach. It is the only way it works. There is no easy shortcut for a top-down solution. And that is the one thing that's very frustrating, because most of the efforts that have been funded and supported for such a long time have been that. It has been, the ISPs are going to self-report, and then we just all have to, accept what they are giving. And it's not accurate. The people that know the answers, the people that have those connections that can get the data, are the ones in those communities. And so how can we mobilize the existing networks from the digital inclusion community, from our social service communities, from our community anchor institutions to do this work is the challenge. That's what we need to do.
Great challenge, great opportunities here. Francella.
Well, I have two things that tugged at me. One was that Mr. Beckett mentioned that, he was learning about Form 477 data. And I almost feel like if we were in a room in Washington, D.C., some people would gasp, right? But one of the things that I feel like is so tender about that is because of the fact that there are thousands of local officials who would say that same exact thing. They don't know anything about Form 477 data. They're like, I don't know anybody at the FCC, but I know my internet's a mess. And so I think that sometimes just being able to be authentic about the fact that I don't know what they're doing somewhere else, but I know that this is what we have here and this is all we've got. And I think something else that really, that I think I'll take with me is that when Brad mentioned putting something on pizza boxes, the reason why is not because I'm like, obviously everybody loves pizza, but I think something about the fact that just plain language, how do we talk to our neighbors about an issue that affects them to empower them to do something, right? And your something might be at a town hall meeting, your something might be filing comments, your something might be testimony, your something might be a blog post in the church newsletter, right? But the thing is to actually meet people where they are. And if you're on a pizza box or if I meet you in a proceeding, either way, your voice is valuable. And so I think something about that, about us being able to let go of titles and tenure and who deciding on who is anointed with good ideas and trusting that community leaders actually know something about what they're doing and have something to teach us about this process.
Wow, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with everything you just said, although I'm going to hold on to my tenure with all the strength I can muster. But, you know, I think the other thing is what I'm also hearing is having a safe space to have these conversations and to ask these questions and to be in a space where we can Peter, like you said, just say like, what is, I don't know what Form 477 is, but here's what we're doing. And we're doing a lot of really great work. This incredibly valuable to have spaces like this. My next question is, you know, we've talked a lot, and by we, I mean researchers and journalists and policymakers and lawmakers. We talk a lot about what is wrong with the maps and with the data, but we don't have a lot of conversations about what we can do with better data. So I'm just wondering, first of all, like, why does good data matter? And second of all, what can we do with this good data? How might decisions be better with better data? Samantha, I'll start with you.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of exception to the word good data, because almost every type of data out there is good in a certain context or in a certain light, right? It's not that one data set is good and another is bad. It's just they tell us different things and they paint different stories, and we can expect to glean different levels of information from them. And so, you know, not when I talked about proprietary, like UCLA data is used very, very commonly. That is a proprietary data set. It costs a lot of money to have access to that data set or the tools to collect it. And so it's not to say that that is a bad data set or a bad methodology, but it's less accessible. And so it's not an equitable choice as, say, Measurement Labs, open source, transparent, complete, Creative Commons licensed data set and tools, right? Because everyone can play, everyone can look at how it works, everyone can comment on it, the research community has full access, there's nothing to hide. And it's not to say that that method is better, but it's more open and transparent. And so that builds more equity into the system. It means that we can have a better open conversation, and we can have the value of the research community in a way that can really inform how we can do things better. And that is, you can't do that with a closed system. And so I don't want to say that necessarily one is bad and one is not, but I think there are incredible value to be had from open and transparency open, transparent forms of data and data collection.
That's a great point. I love this idea that all data has something to give us and something to add to the conversation. Francella, what can we do with data, layered data, more data? What can we do with this?
Well, a couple of things, and I do want to revisit something that now that Samantha's brought it up again about proprietary nature, just for historical background, that originally when the FCC originally started collecting data was actually considered proprietary at the FCC. So the thing is that there's a culture of actually protecting the information that we collect. And mind you, that was with public funds. It took a FOIA lawsuit to actually give that sunlight so that essentially the public had access to the information that they were collecting. And even then, the FCC cited something that was very important, was that in their opposition, their point was, and they sided with the incumbents on that it would actually increase competition. And so here we are in 2021 where we're like, maybe that's a good thing, right? That we can actually say, okay, so if we have better information about who has access, who doesn't, and maybe who has inferior access, we can start answering questions about what's the solution. Now, I think to Samantha's point about how we actually use it, how we tailor it, in somewhere like Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands, good data, good information might tell us well, this is a place where wireless solutions might be better than a wire line because this neighborhood is still struggling with regular connectivity 7 days a week. In places like Western New York, where you have maybe some rural populations who've actually had to rely on philanthropic partners to collect information about who's connected, maybe that means we're identifying how much money needs to be invested into certain communities versus another. And even in places like Texas, I know that I've spoken to a lot of community leaders, philanthropic partners, and other local government advocates who have essentially had to collect information to be able to not only inform how they're going to use government funding, maybe things that have come in through COVID resources and others, but also to be able to shape priorities for their new state broadband office. So the thing is, I think there are lots of different ways where we can use it, but there's a general consensus that when we have a better grasp on not only who has access to being connected, but who is actually connected and who is facing those ongoing barriers, it's a lot easier to be able to address those connectivity gaps with targeted solutions.
Absolutely. Our communities can definitely be empowered when they see themselves reflected in the maps and in the data. Speaking of maps and data, you know, everyone is abuzz because the NTIA just released this large multi-layered map, clickable, searchable, colorful, you know, all of the things above. And I wonder if we could spend a little bit of time thinking about this map or reflecting on it. What, if anything, will this map add to the conversation that we're having today? What are some important takeaways that we can, well, take away from the map? And what are you all maybe excited about? And what are the things that maybe could be improved about the map? Kathryn, if you'd like to start us off.
Sure. I think, you know, with the NTIA map, a couple of things. First, it comes back to what are we trying to use this information for? And is this about politics? Is it about informing policy, or is it about decision making? And thinking about those three pieces of thinking about those three considerations, I think is important, particularly when you're looking at a map like NTIA's. And one of the things that I particularly thought was noteworthy about NTIA's is just adding on even socioeconomic data. And this is something that we are seeing states do more often. And I know localities are also doing this. And they're doing that because it gives us a more robust understanding of where funding is needed and which communities may benefit the most from those connections. And what this is going to tie to, and I swear there's a point with this, is about setting a plan, or excuse me, setting a goal and making a plan. And we can have all of the data sets in the world. We can layer Ookla on top of MLab on top of, like, name it, just pile them all on. We can look at it and say, like, okay, cool, that's good, this is helpful. It validates a lot of what we're hearing in the field, which is useful. But what are we building to? And when we think about particularly national data sets, I think I keep coming back to this idea of what's our goal? What's our outcome? When we talk about universal availability, what does that actually look like? Because, like, I don't know about y'all, but I feel like I don't really have a firm grasp of that concept at this point. But what I think is noteworthy about this NTIA data is that we are seeing more inputs coming together and a very public acknowledgement of the limitations of the existing federal communications data, and an acknowledgement that, like, we need to be thinking about other factors other than whether or not a connection exists or doesn't.
Yeah, Francella, I'm seeing some nods of agreement there, so I'd like to turn to you about reflections on the NTIA map.
+1 to everything that Kathryn said. And one of the first things that I thought when I opened it, I thought a lot. I had Ricky Santiago, a digital inclusion superhero from Louisville, Kentucky, in my mind about where you find poverty, you will find the digital divide. That stays with me all the time. And I think that was one of the first explicit acknowledgements that if we look on a map, wherever you find poverty, you will find that digital divide. And very often poverty, it's like a dirty word, right? We don't like to talk about it when it comes to broadband. It's like low income. It's like, it's not my thing. I'm just worried about making sure everybody can get connected. It's always treated as something that's separate, right? But the thing is, we're not going to be able to solve this issue if we don't address the fact that the digital divide is born of other issues related to poverty, right? So it doesn't matter if you have gigabit infrastructure down the street, if you can't afford to connect to it, that's still a problem. And it's not just a problem for the household that can't connect, it's a problem for everyone in that local ecosystem that they touch. So I do think that good on NTIA for taking this additional step. I think it is proof that we need to think about it, to Kathryn's point, as in layered with other socioeconomic issues. And I think that this should be a moment that we think about in the same way that we treat food insecurity and housing insecurity as a problem that requires specific redress. We should be doing the same with broadband.
Yeah, absolutely. And a good reminder that none of these are zero-sum games. It's not like it's broadband or nothing, or deployment or nothing, or affordability and nothing. It's all of these issues need to be addressed because they're intersectional. Absolutely. Samantha, to you now, please.
Great. Thank you. I honestly, between Kathryn and Francella, they made great points, both of them. One of the things that I continually get a concern about is when we have so many different data sets layered on top of them, is that it gives the impression that the type of data, the shape of data, the way that that data was collected is equivalent, is able, it's not always the same thing. It sets us up for comparing apples to oranges a lot of times, because MLab and Ookla are different speed tests, right? They're both in the NTIA data form, but they're different. And so to compare them is not exactly the right way to go about using that data, because the way that the speed tests work is not equivalent. So it's not you can't vet one against the other necessarily, just as you can't really vet, poverty data against speed test data. Like, you can't say, well, they're not impoverished because there's a bunch of people getting really high speeds. Like, you can't use that in that way. The logic doesn't work. And so I think that stacking so many things up against another can be misleading. So that would be my biggest concern, is that, like Kathryn said, I'm not sure that the tool was built with an ultimate intentionality behind it. It was more like, let's just grab everything and stick it in a pot and stir. And I'm not sure if that leads us to better insights or more questions around sound methodology.
I'm hearing, Kathryn, did you want to respond? Sorry.
The one thing that I was going to add, that I think with the map itself, that also it underscored for me, and I think this is building on Francella's point, and Samantha, I'm sure you'll hit this if you haven't hit this specific point. We're talking about for-profit entities. So I think that, when we pull in other socioeconomic data, particularly income, we see some patterns, and companies, for-profit entities behaving rationally and logically. So to me, and Chris, you made this point earlier about, like, how do we value broadband? We, in this age of 2021 and moving forward, is it an essential service? How do we make sure that every American has access to that essential service? We also need to remember, as we think about policy, that we are operating in an environment where we're working with for-profit companies. They have a responsibility to their shareholders. So we need to pivot back to policymakers and think about looking at that NTIA data and the map, to Francella's point. Anyway, I'm not going to rehash this. It introduces additional questions about how we're thinking about prioritizing funding and where we go from here.
And may I add something?
Agreed.
I do want to make sure that when we're thinking about, number one, I don't want perfection to be the enemy. Okay. I think that different agencies, different organizations, different businesses are going to generate different sets of information for different purposes. So the thing is, I do not begrudge private stakeholders for making money, or government agencies for trying to get something out by a certain deadline, and that's all we had. I understand that. What I think is that we need to be very clear about the fact that whatever information is shared It should be something that, to Samantha's earlier point, is transparent and that it's actually open for public review. And that also we think about what is the challenge process. And I do want to bring up, just to bring into this, one example from Mississippi because it was so egregious. And this was back in, I think this was a 2009 challenge. It was the Farm Bureau and the Public Service Commission in the state of Mississippi that essentially challenged FCC data. The FCC says you have over 70, I think it was around 72% of your residents are actually served by wireline. And I think that the real number was something closer to 20%. I don't remember the exact number. So they collect all of these speed tests. None of these challenges are accepted. The point is that they essentially couldn't survive a really complicated challenge process, even though there's to some extent a conception, it wasn't great information to start with. And I think one thing that we can learn from that is that if we are to generate these data sets, we have to make sure that people have a challenge process that is robust, that is vigorous, that we are able to get local voices to be able to go up and challenge state and federal data, and that when federal data is wrong, that state maps that are based on federal data, I believe state of Iowa, or I think it was state of Iowa, and also it bases their information on the FCC, but they said, but hold on a second, we're gonna let people challenge that data if it's wrong. So the thing is, sometimes I understand that we have resource limitations where we have to live with the data that we have. But I think that we can put in common sense mechanisms that allow people to correct information that we all know is wrong.
Fantastic. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I agree. Snaps and claps for that. You know, we're unfortunately we're running out of time, which is crazy because we could have, you know, just kept going because there's so much to talk about with mapping and localism and NTIA and good data and public versus private. But I unfortunately need to give you each kind of your last minute, your last reflection. If you could maybe talk about what was some take home points or what's next on the horizon. Samantha, would you like to start us off, please?
Ooh, it's tough. You know, I wanted to, while I was listening to this conversation, it occurred to me that one thing we don't talk a lot about is the type of research that leads to better technology as well. So we often talk about using existing technology to reach those that are unconnected, and that is absolutely, you know, the first on the list. But there's also the long run, that having better intelligence about how networks work and perform will help us lead to understanding what kinds of mechanisms could help us to deliver better service through improvements in the technology itself. That doesn't necessarily mean replacement of fiber or something, but it can mean how we route information through our fiber networks, right? It can mean, you know, what type of networks perform better in different areas and under different environmental environments and geographies. And so as the Marconi Society, our network is very much a technologist network. And so I want to just make sure that that's acknowledged as well, that as we're continuing to try to connect more people, there's a whole area of people and researchers and engineers that are trying to create the technologies for tomorrow's network. And so the more we know about it, the better tomorrow's network will be.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Kathryn, 1 minute to sum it all up.
Accountability. I mean, that's a better data. It tells us what the problem is. It helps us make sure that we are spending funds in the way that they are intended to be spent. It helps us make sure that communities are getting the connections that they are promised. It helps us measure progress. That's a long way of me saying it helps us all be better and more effective stewards of public funds. And if we don't look at the numbers and the amount of money that we have spent to date on the digital divide, and still look at this gap that we have and say, ooh, we need to think a little bit differently about how we do this. We need to make sure that the public sector has the authority and the capability to draft better policy, draft stronger policy, and then implement programs and oversee those programs in a way that ensures that communities get the connections that they were served. We are going to be coming back to this problem in another 5 years. So if I could leave everybody with one thought, it's better accountability.
Better accountability. Excellent. Francella, last thought of the day goes to you.
Well, our team, we think that the digital divide is something that we can solve in our lifetimes. We know that it depends on us being able to identify who has service and who is still waiting. And we want to avoid a new digital divide that we are creating that's going to be here decades from now. So we're really excited just to be able to do this work. We're excited to be able to lift up local voices that do not often get invited into our forums. But I'm particularly thankful, especially for my broadband sister, Kathryn, for Samantha, Chris, all of the people behind the scenes, Ryan and Dustin, who put this this whole production together, and just the whole ISOC and NCC team. You guys really are superheroes in my book every day.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our broadband superheroes. I love it. We're at the end of our time, but we can definitely have kept this conversation going. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing your wisdom today. I have learned so much from all of you. I want to thank Internet Society and Next Century Cities for hosting us, and point you all to Next Century Cities' fantastic report that inspired this conversation, broadband mapping across the US, local, state, and federal methods and contradictions, which is available on their website. Thank you all very much to those who attended, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.